Hello everyone, and wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're uncovering a dangerous secret hidden inside a single sheet of paper someone has forged Mrs. Nghria's signature to trigger a company audit and take everything she built. But Yuri has just found the proof. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. The fog was still thick over the tea hills when Tu Tieu lit the stove that morning. It was the kind of morning that asked nothing of you, quiet, cool, the air smelling faintly of damp earth and wood smoke. She moved through her small kitchen with the ease of long habit, setting the kettle to boil, arranging the cups, slicing a piece of bread to toast on the pan. She always said that the morning belonged to simple things, that if you started the day with care, the care stayed with you a little longer. Somewhere beneath the peacefulness of her routine, a low hum of worry had been running all night like a stream under ice. The strange tension Yuri had carried in his voice during their last call. Tu Tieu couldn't name exactly what she was afraid of, but she had learned to listen to the feeling, the way you listen to wind before rain. When Yuri called, the kettle had just begun to whistle. His voice came through the phone tired and thin, like cloth that had been stretched too many times. He told her the office had a strange feeling that morning people arriving early, speaking in low voices near the finance department, doors that were usually open staying closed. He didn't know yet what it was. He only knew that something had shifted overnight, the way you know when you step into a room and the air itself tells you something happened here. Tu Tieu poured her tea slowly. "Before you walk in," she said, "take 5 minutes. Just 5. Then Yuri's voice softer. "You always say the right thing," she replied gently. "That's not always the same. Go, I'll be here." She sat with her cup for a long moment after the call ended, watching the fog begin to thin at the edges where the sun was trying to come through. Then she opened her small notebook and wrote the date at the top of a clean page. She didn't know yet what she would fill it with, but she had a feeling she would need it. The letter arrived at the construction company just before 8 in the morning, delivered by registered post and signed for by the receptionist before anyone senior had come in. By the time the finance department head opened it, 3 other staff members were already looking over his shoulder. It was an official audit notice, a formal tax and financial review with a response deadline of 14 days and a list of documents required for submission. The language was bureaucratic and dense, but the meaning underneath was simple and sharp. The company's accounts would be under scrutiny, and if anything could not be explained clearly, certain funds could be frozen while the review was ongoing. The news moved through the office the way all bad news does, faster than facts, slower than fear. By 9 o'clock, people in the hallway were already speculating in hushed voices. If the accounts were frozen, payroll could not be processed. If payroll stopped, workers at the construction sites would walk off. And if materials could not be purchased, the current projects would stall. Contracts would be breached. Penalties would follow. The domino of it all pressed on every person who understood the chain. Someone had reported the company. That was what people said to each other in low tones near the coffee station, near the stairwell, near the printer room. Not an anonymous complaint, a specific, detailed report that had pointed auditors toward a particular transaction and a particular date. Nghia arrived at the office with her usual composure, her posture straight and unhurried, her expression carrying the quiet authority of someone who has seen difficult mornings before. She read the letter carefully at her desk, once through without stopping, then again more slowly. When she finished, she asked for the original envelope and all attached pages to be brought to her, and she went through each one methodically, making small notes in the margin of her notepad. The transaction date that the auditors had flagged overlapped precisely with the weeks she had been ill, the period when she had been at home, when others had been handling decisions in her name. She noted this without comment, but the stillness that settled over her face told something to anyone watching carefully. Lynn appeared in the finance office before 10, dressed professionally, her expression warm with concern and readiness. She was the kind of person who always seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment to offer exactly the right kind of help. She spoke calmly to the finance team, her voice measured and reassuring. She understood the pressure they were under, she said. She had experience handling compliance situations. She could prepare the response, package the documents, the explanations, the formal reply to the auditors, so that the deadline would be met without panic. She also suggested, gently but firmly, that it would make sense to centralize financial access during the review period. One point of contact, she said. Cleaner, more professional, less room for confusion. She offered to reach out to the auditors directly. Just to open communication, she explained, to show good faith. No need for a formal meeting yet, just a quiet, professional phone call. MrsNghia's was standing in the doorway when Lynn said this. Thank you, MrsNghia's said, and her voice carried no accusation. If communication goes out under the company's name, it goes out with shared knowledge and a proper log. I only meant to ease the burden on you. You can ease it by staying with us. MrsNghia's replied pleasantly. If you're going to act on the company's behalf, I would need that in writing a proper delegation with your scope clearly defined. Would you be able to prepare that today? For just a moment, the length of a blink, Lynn's smile held a fraction of a second too long. Then she nodded gracefully. Naturally, I'll draft something. She turned back toward the corridor, and the warmth in the room dropped by several degrees without anyone being able to say exactly why. MrsNghia's called a quiet meeting with her department heads that afternoon in her office. She did not raise her voice. She did not use words like betrayal or suspicion. She used words like process and clarity and record. She instructed that no document was to leave the building without being logged by 2 people. She asked for a full list of bank signatories and any changes made to that list in the past 6 months. She requested that the board minutes from the last 3 meetings be brought to her for review, especially any resolutions that had passed under emergency or delegated authority. Lynn, seated at the side of the room, mentioned that the board had already approved certain temporary operational measures during MrsNghia's illness. The measures had been necessary, she said. The situation had demanded flexibility. Nghia nodded slowly. Then the minutes will reflect that clearly, she said. She added, looking around the room with a gaze that was calm and kind and left no room for misunderstanding. Every step we take during this review must be something we can explain to anyone, anytime. That protects all of us. After the meeting, as people filed out, the room felt slightly different. Steadier, somehow. Like the floor had been checked and found solid. Yuri heard about the account restriction forms by accident, in the way that honest people often hear about dishonest plans, not because someone tells them, but because they are quiet enough in a hallway at the right moment. He was coming down the back stairwell when he caught 2 words from a half-open door. Controlled disbursement. He stopped. Through the gap, he could see Lynn speaking on her phone, her voice low and efficient, using the language of finance the way a surgeon uses instruments with precision, without warmth. She was describing a process by which a temporary measure would restrict certain account transactions and route authorization through a single approved contact. The contact, it was clear from her tone, would be her. He didn't make a sound. He waited until she had moved away from the window. Then he went to find the colleague who had access to the authorization forms in question. He asked to see them calmly, as if it were routine. He took photographs of the relevant pages with his phone. He wrote down the reference numbers and the dates in the small notebook he always kept in his jacket pocket. His heart was beating faster than his face showed. He was thinking about his mother, about how hard she had worked to build something steady, and how quietly someone was working to take the ground out from under it. But he did not let the fear turn into heat. He let it turn into attention. He became, in that stairwell and in that small records room, very careful and very still. She was at the tea house table by then, her notebook open, her tea long cold beside her. She had been writing down everything he had told her across the day's calls, names, times, phrases she thought might matter later. It was a quiet kind of help, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but builds something solid over time. "I feel like I'm walking through mud," Yuri told her. "Every step I take, the ground shifts." "Then slow down," Tu Tieu said. "When they rush you, slow your hands. Read again. Don't answer pressure instantly, that's what pressure wants you to do. What if slowing down lets them get ahead? What if rushing makes you miss the one thing that matters?" She answered gently. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I found something in the system, a form Lynn is preparing. If it goes through, she becomes the only authorized contact on the main accounts. Not my mother, her." Tu Tieu's pen stopped moving. "Can that be stopped? Only if my mother doesn't sign it, and only if someone can prove it was never properly authorized in the first place." "Then find the authorization," Tu Tieu said simply. "Somewhere there's a paper trail. There always is." The finance files were not easy to sort through. There were years of records layered like sediment contracts, payment orders, meeting resolutions, approval memos. Yuri worked through them quietly the following morning with a sympathetic staffer who had been with the company for a long time and trusted MrsNghia's, the way people trust things that have never failed them. It was this staffer who first pointed to the document. It was attached to the audit response package, a signed authorization form for a specific financial transaction. The one the auditors had flagged. The form carried MrsNghia's name in the signature field. It showed the date, the amount, the recipient account. It looked complete. It looked official. "This came from Lynn's side of the documentation," the staffer said quietly. "I remember, because I didn't prepare it, and no one in our team did." Yuri looked at the document for a long time. He noticed something not dramatic, not immediately obvious, but there, if you were looking. The way the loop at the top of the N sat just a little too open, the spacing between the letters pulled in a way that felt careful rather than natural. And the file's upload timestamp, visible in the document system's metadata, showed it had been added 3 days ago, after the audit letter arrived, not before. He printed the document carefully. Then he went to MrsNghia's filing cabinet and pulled out a signed contract from 2 years ago, one he knew was authentic, because it had been notarized. He laid both papers side by side under the desk lamp in the small records room and looked at them together. The differences were quiet, but they were there. That evening, Lynn called a brief meeting. She sat across from MrsNghia's, a board representative present by phone, the finance head in the room. She spoke with polished urgency. The 14-day deadline was, in reality, a soft figure, she explained. The auditors expected a response within 48 hours to demonstrate good faith. If the company delayed, it would look uncooperative, and an uncooperative company during a tax review faced far heavier scrutiny. She slid a prepared response package across the table. "If you sign here," she said, "we can get this submitted tonight." MrsNghia looked at the package without touching it. "I won't sign anything I haven't reviewed in full," she said. "Not tonight. Not under a deadline created by this table." Lynn's voice stayed smooth but sharpened at the edges. "With respect, the board has asked us to be responsive. Any delay puts the whole company at risk." A message notification came through on the finance head's phone, a short, pointed note from Mr. Tuan. "Do what Lynn suggests. Don't complicate things." MrsNghia looked at the message when the finance head turned the screen toward her. She read it without expression. Then she looked at Lynn. "I will review the package overnight," she said, "and tomorrow morning, with counsel." Yuri, standing near the door, asked one final question. "Do you have the original signed copy of the authorization form, the one attached to the audit package?" Lynn looked at him. "That's already on file." "I'd like the physical original," Yuri said, his voice entirely calm. "Not a scan. The actual paper." Then she smiled and said she would locate it. She gathered her papers and left. That night, Yuri sat alone in the small records room with only a desk lamp for company. He placed the two documents side by side again, the flagged authorization form and the old authenticated contract. He had brought a magnifying glass this time. He looked at the signature on the audit document for a long, careful while. He looked at the old one. His chest tightened with a feeling that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between them, the feeling of watching someone you love be used as a tool by a hand they never saw coming. He picked up his phone and dialed. The call connected on the second ring. "Tu Tieu," he said, his voice quiet and steady as still water. "I found it." She was awake. He had known she would be. The approval document, the one the auditors were given, the signature on it. He exhaled slowly. "It's not my mother's. Someone forged MrsNghia's name, and they used it to trigger the audit." The line was silent for a moment. Then Tu Tieu's voice came through, careful and firm. "Don't move anything. Don't tell anyone else tonight. Not until we know who had access." "I know," Yuri said. Outside the window, the city had grown dark and quiet, but inside that small circle of lamplight, with two documents and a discovered truth, the night felt anything but still. Somewhere, someone was waiting to see if the forgery would hold. It wouldn't. The morning begins quietly at Tu Tieu's tea house. But peace doesn't last long. A formal audit letter arrives at MrsNghia's construction company, threatening to freeze accounts, delay payroll, and halt ongoing projects. Someone has reported the company, and the timing points directly to the period when MrsNghia was ill and away from the office. Lynn steps in immediately, offering to help manage the crisis. But her real goal is to seize control of the company's finances by becoming the sole authorized contact. MrsNghia holds firm, demanding transparency and shared records at every step. Meanwhile, Yuri works quietly behind the scenes, collecting evidence and listening carefully. When he finally locates the document the auditors were given, something stops him cold. The signature carrying MrsNghia's name doesn't belong to her. Someone forged it and used it to destroy everything she built.